Quaker Ridge's neighborhoods are in the southeastern part of Scarsdale. They were developed much later than the rest of the village and still have some of the loveliest stretches of parkland and untouched nature. The area known as Quaker Ridge also extends into the neighboring towns of Mamaroneck and New Rochelle, and it was named for the religious society of Friends, known as the Quakers, who began settling in Westchester in the 1600s. Tucked away on Colonial Road is the Griffin Cemetery, also known as the Colonial Acres Cemetery, where some of Scarsdale's first Quaker families are buried.
The Griffin family set aside this parcel of land as a burial ground for their loved ones in the 18th century. Over the years, the families would sell off portions of their farms, so their farms would shrink and get smaller and smaller and smaller. And oftentimes, the area was subdivided, sort of like the Colonial Acres neighborhood is right now. The family burial grounds are often the only surviving portions of these original farms. Most of the burials in Westchester County of people who died before the Revolutionary War, they were marked by these uninscribed fieldstones, with maybe occasionally an inscription of an initial or a year of death, but that's about it. This tombstone marks the grave of Nathaniel Brown, and his wife Anna, who's outlived him by 10 years, was laid to rest beside her husband when she died in 1854. Nathaniel and his wife Anna purchased the Griffin farm, and their home still stands on the Mamaroneck Road. Nathaniel served 2 years as supervisor of the town of Scarsdale. When Nathaniel died in 1844, he set aside this burial ground, and he asked that his executors build a stone wall to enclose the cemetery. The oldest inscribed tombstone in the Griffin Cornell family burial ground is that of Ruth Merritt. She died on January 2nd, 1822 at the age of 85. Today, her headstone lies flat on the ground, and just to the left of it is her footstone, which still stands upright with the initials RM.
About a third of the population of pre-revolutionary Scarsdale was Quaker. In 1774, with the exception of the land between the Bronx River and Post Road, the Cornells and Griffins owned most of the property in Scarsdale. Richard Cornell was one of Scarsdale's first Quakers. He was born in 1670 and migrated to Scarsdale from Cow Neck, Long Island, in the 1720s. The house his family and descendants lived in is now a part of the Westchester Reformed Temple on Mamaroneck Road. In agreement between the temple and the newly formed Scarsdale Committee for Historical Preservation saved the landmark from demolition in the 1990s. Local historian Barbara Shay MacDonald was on the committee, and they worked with Donald Carpenter, an expert in 18th century architecture, to prove the historic value of the house.
And we had to climb through a hole in the ceiling to get into the attic. I mean, it was really historical, but it was such great fun because it was all done like within 24 hours. And they had to call an emergency meeting and everything because the building was about to be torn down. And we found these handmade rose-headed nails and hand-hewn oak timbers. And everyone got just so excited. It was like contagious. It's just so beautiful. It's important. Why take it down when it could have a use?
Many of the Quakers who settled in Westchester in the 17th and 18th century were able to form safer communities, away from the harsh treatment they had suffered by the Puritans in New England and the Dutch in Long Island and New Amsterdam. George Fox and his wife Margaret Fell were early founders of the Quaker movement that began in England in the 1600s. They radically dissented from the established church and preached that God was in everyone, and individuals had an inner spirit that allowed them to directly communicate with God without the guidance of church authorities. Fox and his followers were punished and imprisoned for heresy, but the time was ripe for dissent against the Church of England, and the movement gradually spread throughout Europe and the New World. Quaker life was very restrictive. They dressed plainly and banned the use of tobacco and alcohol. Marriage with non-Quakers was also forbidden. The Quakers, also called Friends, worshipped in unadorned meeting houses.
Scarsdale's first Quaker meeting house was built in 1739 in Mamaroneck, and the Quakers moved it to Weaver Street in 1768. After a theological split occurred within the society, a second meeting house was built beside it in 1828. By the 1970s, the meeting house was being used as a garage for Freyden Manachurian's vintage cars. He offered it to us, and we decided it was important to preserve it. The house was carefully taken apart and reconstructed on Post Road next to the Cudner Hyatt House Museum. We used the house for exhibitions and as our offices until 2020, when the property was sold. The first exhibition shown in the house in 1977 was, of course, called Quaker Memorabilia.
The Quakers' core testimonies emphasized truthfulness, equality, education, nonviolence, and the humane treatment of all people. Members of the Society of Friends were at the forefront of organized efforts to end slavery, advocate for prison reform, and campaign for women's rights. Friends believed men and women were equal under God, and this was very forward-thinking in the 17th century. They were allowed to preach and travel to spread the word, sometimes risking their lives to do so. In 1660, Mary Dyer was put on trial and hanged in the Massachusetts Bay Colony for defying the ban against Quakers. She was also thought to be possessed by the devil because she had once given birth to a stillborn baby that was deformed. Anne Hutchinson, for whom the Hutchinson River and Parkway are named, was also tried for heresy by the Puritans. She was a charismatic preacher who held popular Quaker meetings in her home and the mother of 13 children. She was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and her main accuser, Governor John Winthrop, complained she was a hell-spawned agent of destructive anarchy, as well as a woman of nimble wit with a voluble tongue more bold than a man. In 1643, soon after Hutchinson and her family moved to what is now the Bronx, they were killed by Native Americans during the Kieft War. Anne Hutchinson's 9-year-old daughter Susanna was the only survivor, and she lived with a native tribe until she was an adult. The Quakers were the first known religious group to condemn slavery on moral grounds. In 1688, the Pennsylvania Germantown Quakers made a failed attempt to petition an end to slavery. It was rejected by the society because some Quakers still depended on enslaved people and profited from the slave trade in Barbados. Friends would finally require their members to free their adult slaves and ensure their independence in 1774. Many Quakers would also have pivotal roles in New York's gradual manumission of enslaved people by 1827, and in the abolitionist movements leading up to the Civil War. In Scarsdale, the census records between 1790 and 1810 shows that a quarter of the households, including Quakers, used between 1 and 10 enslaved African Americans to work on their farms and in their homes. There were a few families who challenged the slaveholding system. Joseph Carpenter, the son of a prosperous farmer and blacksmith in Scarsdale, was one of Westchester's leading abolitionists. He married Margaret Cornell in 1814, and they moved to New Rochelle after the birth of their son, Jonathan.
This bridge was put in 1910 so that the cattle could cross over the river. And of course, this river was part of the whole Sheldrake Reservoir system. And at one time, the Carpenters, particularly Jonathan Carpenter, Joseph's son, had a sawmill here. Joseph Carpenter's farm extended for acres, including this parcel, which is right off what is now Daisy Farms Road. He had originally come from Scarsdale and bought property that stretched to the Scarsdale line, which he used as a farm, but also used for Underground Railroad activities. What we know of Joseph Carpenter is through the letters he wrote to the National Anti-Slavery Standard, the newspaper, as well as the accounts that Lydia Marie Childs give of him. And she was an extensive letter writer and diarist, and many of those letters have been printed, so they are accessible.
Lydia Child was a prolific writer and the editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which, along with the newsletter, The Liberator, founded by William Lloyd Garrison, was the leading voice of the abolitionist movement. At 22, she wrote Hobomok, a historical novel about Native Americans and an interracial couple. It was first published anonymously. She was also the celebrated author of The Frugal Housewife, a guide for poor and middle-class women, but her popularity plummeted after she published an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans. It was the first book-length proposal in America to condemn slavery and call for its immediate end. In 1834, when Child was threatened by anti-abolitionist violence in New York City, she sheltered with the Carpenters for 6 months.
Lydia Marie Child stayed there for quite a time and talks about an interracial household. He brought in children who were orphaned. He was constantly bringing in former slaves as well as people of color who were destitute or needed work, and they lived in the house with the Carpenters on the farm. He also harbored those who had been found guilty of freeing slaves or giving safe haven to slaves.
Although slavery was illegal in New York State by 1827, Congress enacted the Fugitive Slave Laws in 1793 and in 1850, which allowed for the capture and return of escaped slaves to their owners. Bounty hunting flourished, and free blacks also lived in fear of being kidnapped and illegally sold into slavery. Anyone caught helping fugitives faced fines and imprisonment. The radical black abolitionist David Ruggles also stayed at the Carpenters, and they cared for him when he was in ill health and going blind. Ruggles was a founder of the New York Committee of Vigilance, an organization that legally challenged the practice of kidnapping and capturing black people. He was also known to help over 600 people escape from slavery, including the renowned abolitionist Frederick Douglass.
The Underground Railroad, of course, was a covert operation, so the documentation is extremely limited. It's a big jigsaw puzzle, and we're constantly finding new information. The fugitives would come up from the south to cross Long Island Sound. They would be taken in by the abolitionists who were running the mills, and then make their way up to North New Rochelle, which was not nearly as inhabited, to Joseph Carpenter's farm, before they were then led to safe houses in Pleasantville and then further north up into Canada. Lydia Marie Childs went so far in one of her letters to say that Mr. Carpenter's Underground Railroad activities were the most extensive in the country. He was also part of the movement to stop using products that had been made by slaves. Abolitionists wouldn't wear cotton, and they wouldn't use sugar.
Joseph Carpenter was an articulate regular contributor to the National Anti-Slavery Standard. He often used biting sarcasm to get his points across. In this letter condemning the use of slave products, he wrote, "I confess that it has been with pain and surprise that I have beheld men and women overflowing with the most benevolent and humane feelings, endowed by nature with intellect of the highest order, exerting their giant minds to the utmost to justify and sanctify the use of the products of robbery and oppression, with as much zeal and as good success, in my opinion, as the slave-holding clergy of the South have succeeded in establishing the justice and righteousness of slavery." Margaret and Joseph's children would continue their parents' work. Daughter Esther was a feminist and close friend of Lydia Marie Child. She married Moses Pierce, who, like his father Joseph Pierce, was a radical abolitionist. Their home in Pleasantville was a safe stop on the Underground Railroad. Many freedom seekers who made the perilous journey to Canada on their own or with the help of the Quakers settled in southern Quebec and Nova Scotia. Some returned to fight in the Civil War or to find their families.
Because there was no place for proper burials for people of color, Joseph Carpenter set aside a parcel of land on his farm. He deeded it to the surrounding towns of New Rochelle, Mamaroneck, Eastchester, and Scarsdale. First burial was in 1837. It was a public cemetery because nobody was denied burial. We estimate that over 400 individuals were buried on Carpenter's property. Burials went on here until 1909 when the property was purchased by Francis Stratton.
The Stratton Mansion is now a school run by the Westchester Torah Academy. The original caretaker house and Carpenter Cemetery is only a few feet away from the school.
By the 1940s, when the Daughters of the American Revolution were doing a total inventory of cemeteries in New Rochelle, they described it as being completely overgrown. And in fact, this burial ground has continued to be largely abandoned ever since the early 1900s. So right now it's actually protected. If any changes are going to be made to the property owners need to go before the Historical and Landmarks Review Board before they are given permission to do any alterations. We have a number of individuals, professors and retired professors, working on exploring traditional African and African American burial practices as well as Quaker traditions. We will have archaeologists on site to make sure that this is done properly and with the dignity and with the respect the people who are buried there deserve.
All right, so we're in the Carpenter Cemetery now. You can see it's completely overgrown. There's no trace of a cemetery that you can see. There's beer bottles, a couple of baseballs, but it's really pretty overgrown. But if we go in further, you can see some spots where there's some stones in a row, and then there's a couple of graves that you can stumble upon if you go in deeper. This one here, and then I see going in under there, you can see that cut one underneath. So, all right, so here's a real find under here. We've got a stone, looks like it says HJ engraved in it. It looks to me like it's made out of marble, and it's much more, cut much more carefully than the rough stones that we've seen so far. These are really cool. So Joseph Carpenter, I don't know where his grave would have been.
Both Joseph Carpenter and his wife Margaret were buried in the cemetery. Their friend and abolitionist Aaron Powell describes Joseph's solemn funeral in his memoir. It was an occasion long to be remembered. His body, clothed in his wonted plain friendly costume, was placed for burial in a plain, unstained pine coffin. At the conclusion of the services, the coffin was carried out upon the lawn, in the shade of the trees he loved so well, and then those in attendance, colored and white, gathered about it to take a last look at the face of him, whom they loved and revered. Then it was borne by colored men to its final resting place. Joseph Carpenter's work would continue to impact Quaker Ridge in many ways. Equal education for all was a priority for the Quakers, and for years, Joseph Carpenter pushed town authorities to integrate District 2 schools. This was successful in the Quaker Schoolhouse on Weaver Street. Previously segregated schools had forced some children to walk miles for their lessons. One of Scarsdale's earliest public schools in District 2 was on Griffin Avenue. The original building was expanded, and today it is the caddy headquarters for the Quaker Ridge Golf Club.
This building, built in 1901, was where children from Quaker Ridge and parts of Mamaroneck went to school until 1947, when the current Quaker Ridge Elementary School on Weaver Street was constructed. There were originally 2 school districts in Scarsdale until they merged in 1965. District 1 was most of Scarsdale on the west side, and District 2 served the Quaker Ridge section here and parts of New Rochelle and Mamaroneck. Now, Quaker Ridge had a smaller population of school-aged children because this area was more sparsely developed than the west part of Scarsdale. So this building served as a one-room schoolhouse for grades 1 through 8.
The children had one primary teacher, Miss Isabel Dixon, who taught all subjects for over 30 years. She was hired in 1904 and drove to school in a horse-drawn carriage that she tied to a tree while she was teaching. There were just 42 students at the school when she retired in 1934. The town records indicate there was a Quaker schoolhouse in 1787 near or at Jonathan Griffin's house that is now a private home on Mamaroneck Road. This beautifully renovated private house has survived the ages. During the Revolutionary War, English General William Howe used the Griffin House as his headquarters. Situated high on a hill, the house provided a perfect lookout for troop movements before the Battle of White Plains. The Religious Society of Friends opposes any participation in war, and Quakers who refused to fight suffered at the hands of both armies. Some decided to leave Scarsdale during the war. Joseph Carpenter's father, Jonathan, fled to Long Island, but returned in peace times to resume his trade as a blacksmith. Between 1890 and 1915, Scarsdale's population grew from 633 to over 2,000 people. During this time, the number of farms decreased from 35 to 12. As local farming became less profitable, many farmers decided to subdivide and sell their properties. Quaker Ridge became a fashionable place to build large country estates, and the old Quaker families gradually migrated to other parts of Westchester. Recreational parks and social clubs were formed to entertain the new high society moving to Scarsdale. But wealth did not overcome the exclusion of people based on their religion, sex, or race. Jews were not always welcome in Scarsdale, and they organized their own social clubs. The Quaker Ridge Golf Club was formed by a group of prosperous Jewish businessmen in 1917. They would build a highly successful club on a section of Bradford and Carolyn Road's enormous farm, which had previously belonged to the Griffins. The brilliant golf architect Alfred Warren Tillinghast redesigned the original golf course in 1918 and again in 1927. In his lifetime, Tillinghast designed over 150 golf courses, 16 of them in Westchester County, including the nearby Fenway and Winged Foot courses. The small club grew quickly, attracting celebrities and some of New York's wealthiest people. Department store giant Nathan Strauss, the founder of Macy's and Abraham and Straus, along with Samuel Bloomingdale, the founder of Bloomingdale's, and Louis Gimbel of the Gimbel's department stores, were early members. In the 1920s, George Gershwin and Babe Ruth frequented the club. Babe Ruth was often the guest of Rita Rodney, who was Quaker Ridge's first woman golf champion. Initially, the club was only for men, but women were admitted a few years after the club opened. Horse shows, hunting clubs, and horse racing had long been popular in Westchester, but those sports were revived again in the 1920s. One of the last historic stables remaining in Scarsdale is the Boulder Brook Equestrian Center off Mamaroneck Road.
Boulderbrook was built in 1928 by Christopher Chenery, who, if the name rings a bell, is because he owned Secretariat. His daughter actually owned Secretariat Penny. Started as a riding club. It was quite exclusive. All of horses and Westchester was quite exclusive.
Originally, it had a clubhouse in the front. It had the 11 acres. It was a Victorian, 5,000 square foot, beautiful, beautiful place that was ripped down when they built the fields. There were two houses connected behind me. One was from 1700 and one was from 1930. They actually moved them and placed them where they are now, and that's where I live.
First place goes to number 717.
Through the 30s, 40s, actually through the 60s, had some of the largest horse shows in the country here. This was the second largest horse show to the National Horse Show. It is the second largest horse show to the finals, the National Horse Show at Madison Square Garden. famous people showed here. Jacqueline Bouvier was here when she was 9. Gordon Wright used the facility to train the Olympic team. Boulderbrook changed hands a few times, and at one point, the village of Scarsdale had made an effort to condemn the facility to take it over for their athletic activities. But there was such an outrage at the time. Horses were still so popular that they backed away from taking it over by eminent domain and took the fields in the front, which are now known as the Winston Field, and we are left now with just under 3 acres of the property. And we do maximize it. Right now we have about 40 horses here.
When I was about 16, my brother was 13, we came up here for the first time. You know, we used to ride down Saxon Woods. There was 2 or 3 stables on Saxon Woods Road, and it was $1.50 to ride for an hour. Those places have all since gone.
Nearby Saxon Woods Park had popular bridle paths for all the stables. The park was formed shortly after New York passed the Westchester County Parks Act in 1922. Over 9,000 acres were acquired to create a network of public parks in Westchester. Saxon Woods Park stretches for 700 acres through Quaker Ridge in Scarsdale and Mamaroneck. In colonial days, it was known as Saxton Forest, named for William Saxton, a miller who was loyal to the British Crown during the Revolution. He fled to Canada after the war and was never able to reclaim his property. When the Parks Commission bought the forest from Edward G. Fale and other estate owners, they also purchased the right-of-way for the Hutchinson River Parkway. Acres of virgin forest, farmland, and houses were cleared for the parkway between 1924 and its completion in 1941. It would run for 18 miles from the Connecticut line in Rybrook to the Bronx. The Hutch, as it's called by locals, would be modeled after the landscaped Bronx River Parkway that helped triple Scarsdale's population and increase property values. The county's land acquisition spared one unusual community of smaller homes.
Here on Saxon Woods Road, near to the border of White Plains, a black man named Robert Purdy was able to buy 5 acres of land in 1856. Robert Purdy had been enslaved in the South and made his way to Scarsdale sometime before 1850. He worked as a farm laborer, and he and his wife Lena had 4 daughters and a son. After settling here, the Purdys grew a variety of crops and raised livestock. They were also beekeepers and sold honey. More of these homes were built in the early 20th century as the family grew, and this area became a small, tightly knit black community for well over a century.
Carol Peterson, now in her 80s, is one of Robert Purdy's last relatives still living on Saxon Woods Road. She remembers attending the one-room schoolhouse on Griffin Avenue and shared some rare family photos of earlier days.
Oh, yeah.
This is the house,
That's still there.
and that's the barn up there. My father was born in '04. Aunt Beulah, and I guess that's Uncle Petey and my father, I guess.
Right on the wall.
Okay.
Oh, it's our back.
Now let's see. I'm not sure if this is the Fales.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they owned all of Saxon Woods Park.
Right.
Throughout the 20s and 30s, only a few new houses were built on Saxon Woods Road. This 1924 engineering map shows the difference between the number of lots and houses in the southern and northern parts of Scarsdale. Suburbanization was already underway in Arthur Manor, downtown Scarsdale, Edgewood, Heathcote, and Greenacres. Berkeley had yet to be developed, and Emily Butler would sell her Fox Meadow estate for $1.5 million in 1924. In contrast, the middle and southern parts of Scarsdale were still mostly large estates, small farms, and countryside. By 1932, more estates were subdivided, but lots were slow to be purchased during the Depression years. And it wasn't till the Second World War and the post-war years that more homes were built in Quaker Ridge. Among the new homeowners to come to Quaker Ridge in the 1940s was Wilhelm Weinberg, for whom the Weinberg Nature Center is named. Weinberg was a successful Dutch businessman who also owned an extensive collection of Van Gogh and French Impressionist paintings. He escaped Nazi-occupied Europe, but his wife and 3 children were murdered in the Auschwitz concentration camp. When Wilhelm died in 1957, his estate was bequeathed to the village, and the Weinberg Nature Center was dedicated to the Weinberg family. In 1956, plans were made to build the Westchester Reform Temple on the old Cornell homestead on Mamaroneck Road. It was the first synagogue in Scarsdale, and it would become an important community and religious center. With more young families moving to Scarsdale, some Quaker Ridge elementary students would be rezoned for the new Heathcote School built in 1952. Between 1950 and 1960, 1,178 new single homes were built in Scarsdale, and throughout the 60s, new houses would fill the neighborhood associations of Scarsdale Meadows, Quaker Ridge, West Quaker Ridge, and Colonial Acres. In response to the post-war housing boom, the village passed the so-called look-alike laws. They were intended to preserve the standards of Scarsdale homes and prevent blocks of uniformed housing that looked exactly the same. Fearing a tide of urbanization, the village also prioritized creating parks and protecting open spaces. In 1969, the Scarsdale Pool opened to the delight of residents and children. One of the last large estates in Scarsdale to be subdivided was the property of Lewis Marks, who lived off Weaver Street. Marks was a toy manufacturer, and his company reigned supreme in the 1950s. He was also the father-in-law of Daniel Ellsberg, who released the top-secret Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War in 1971. Marks bought a stately colonial revival brick mansion that had been built in 1903 by Samuel Jarvis. The 20-acre estate also had horses, stables, and a barn. Every Halloween, he would hand out candy and toys to the neighborhood children. When he died at the age of 85 in 1982, his property was sold to developers who built 29 homes. Unfortunately, the historic mansion remained unoccupied and badly neglected for the next 20 years. After much controversy, the village agreed to have it demolished. Today, there is a small population of Quakers in Westchester. The Scarsdale Friends Meeting House on Popham Road is an active place of worship. During World War II, when gas shortage made it hard to travel to the Purchase Meeting House, friends gathered here and at the Girl Scout House on Wayside Lane. The Quakers' legacy is felt throughout Scarsdale, in hidden places and the street signs named for the early settlers who farmed here. And the great humanitarian work of Joseph Carpenter, his family, and colleagues has made a lasting contribution towards a freer and more equitable society.